April 3rd, 1944. The run-up to the victory stage of World War II. A time of intense and serious preparations for D-Day. A period of massive strategic and complex military planning. An effort so intricate, advanced, and cutting-edge, the likes of which had never been seen before. Yet, as Winston Churchill was deep in the planning for the largest seaborne invasion in history, he took time to write a message to Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom. The message read, "Home Secretary,
let me have a report on why the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in a modern court of justice. What was the cost of this trial to the state, observing that the witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with this obsolete tomfoolery to the detriment of necessary work in the courts?"
Good question, Mr. Churchill. Why was an arcane law from the 1700s being used 209 years later to try a woman? Surely this was not a good use of very precious time and resources. A month earlier, in March, one of the most sensational trials in British history took place at London's Old Bailey. 46-year-old Helen Duncan was charged with public mischief, larceny, and contravention of the 1735 Witchcraft Act. The act had not been employed in a court of law for over a century, but after a 7-day trial and a mere 28-minute deliberation, Helen received a guilty verdict and earned herself a 9-month prison sentence. But was she guilty? Born in 1897, Helen was the daughter of a working-class family. From an early age, she claimed to possess clairvoyant abilities and had quite a reputation for frightening her schoolmates with elaborate and gloomy premonitions. She stated that she could see and connect with spirits, and these acts earned her the lovely nickname Hellish Nell. As she got older, she continued to develop and hone her craft, and by the 20th century, she had created a name for herself as a medium. Perfect timing, really. As with the aftermath of World War I and World War II looming on the horizon, there was a huge resurgence in the spiritualist movement. People were desperate to connect with their lost loved ones. Helen would conduct seances where she would produce ectoplasm, a viscous material that would ooze from her mouth and nose. The ectoplasm would sometimes take the shape and the faces of the dead. Sitters of the seance could have a conversation with the mysterious substance. It was incredible, and people flocked to Helen to pay for her services. Yet, for every believer, there was a skeptic. In 1933, Helen faced prosecution after a sitter grabbed the ectoplasm, only to find a handful of fabric. Yet, others found comfort and closure through Helen's seances. But her most famous seance occurred in 1941. While channeling, the ghost of a sailor came through and revealed that his vessel, the HMS Barham, had sunk off the coast of the Mediterranean. Some accounts say that the sailor's name was Sid, and his mother was in attendance of the seance. Other accounts say it was Sid's widow. Regardless, no one at the seance knew the Barham had sunk. The War Office had not reported such an attack. But Helen was right. The HMS Barham had sunk, and 861 British soldiers perished in the attack. How the hell could Helen have known that? It would be months before the War Office would officially declare the attack. This seance was so successful, Helen's notoriety spread quickly throughout her now hometown of Portsmouth, an extremely important and influential naval port. She even garnered the attention of the British Navy, curious how she could have possibly known about the Barham, and what other sensitive military secrets she could be in possession of. And there were other questions being asked of Helen, mainly in regards to her ectoplasm secretions. Helen performed her seances in dark rooms lit by a small red light, a common practice at the time. But when photographer Harvey Metcalf took photos of the ectoplasm in 1928, he used flash photography. And the photos were frankly laughable. The pictures revealed Punch and Judy-like papier-mâché masks and doll faces draped in fabric. Convincing in low light, but ridiculous in reality. Researcher Harry Price also photographed Helen's manifestations in 1931 and revealed that the ectoplasm was little more than cheesecloth and fabric that she had swallowed and regurgitated on command. And was it a ghost who told her about the Barham? Or perhaps one of the family members of the 861 seamen who lost their lives? The reality is, loads of people knew about the attack. And since she lived in Portsmouth, the home port of the vessel, it's likely that she could have picked up that information at a litany of different places. But in January 1944, an event occurred that Helen did not see coming. While hosting a seance in Portsmouth, the police raided the event and alleged that the operation was a sham, a money-making con involving the manifestations and spirits in order to trick good people out of their own hard-earned cash. And that's where Helen picked up the charge for contravention of the Witchcraft Act of 1735. The charge did not mean that she was being tried as a witch, but rather the opposite. This law prohibited and criminalized the pretense of possessing magical powers or supernatural abilities. The law clearly states that witches are not real. So if you claim to have magical powers, you are a fraud. The newspapers declared this as a witch trial, and Helen Duncan is often called the last witch of Scotland. But actually, her trial focused on deception. The prosecution alleged that Helen had knowingly and deliberately deceived her audiences by faking these manifestations. And the jury agreed. Regardless of whether or not she was in fact a medium, wasn't really the issue. But the use of the pretend ectoplasm was clearly a scam. However, this case was so controversial and embarrassing that it led to the law being repealed in 1951. It was replaced with the False Mediums Act, which clearly states that you cannot fake it. It's there to protect consumers and prevent fraud. Whether Helen Duncan was a true medium or a total scammer, her case reminds us of the very delicate boundaries of fear, grief, vulnerability, and how far we will go to get closure, and how far others will go to exploit that need. friends, it's Becca. We are just 3 episodes away from the season 6 finale of The West London Witch. But that doesn't mean that there is not plenty of storytelling still to come over the summer break. While the main show goes on a mini hiatus, the chills and thrills will be alive and well on our Patreon. I am delighted to announce the return of our annual summer reading program. And if reading isn't your thing, don't worry, because I do all the hard work for you. This summer, we will be reading the highly contentious and hotly debated In a Dark Place, the 1992 story of the Snedeker family, more commonly known as the Haunting in Connecticut case. All summer long, I will be reading the book to you, cover to cover, from right here in Cobweb Cottage, pausing along the way to explore the controversies, dig into the facts, and pick apart this truly divisive story. So grab a festive drink, light a candle, and join us on patreon.com. I cannot wait to spend the summer with you. Hello and welcome to episode 113 of The West London Witch, a podcast where we share stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. One of my favorite cities in all of Europe is York. Situated in northeast England, this city feels like a time capsule. Beautifully preserved, this historically rich, ancient city boasts medieval walls, one of the largest Gothic cathedrals in Northern Europe, an incredible railway museum, and of course, the Shambles, a perfectly preserved 14th century street that feels exactly like Diagon Alley. York is magical, packed with history and heritage, and lovely, lovely people. One of my favorite ways to take in and explore a new city is by going on a walking tour. I love to hear the stories, have architectural quirks or oddities pointed out to me, and learn more about the how and why a city looks, feels, and functions the way that it does. York has no shortage of walking tours, but the Witches Tour is the most spellbinding of them all. Today, Nyx and David, 2 of the Witches Tour guides, join us to share stories about 2 of the witches featured on the tour. Both stories are tragic, problematic, and have dire conclusions. But are these stories about magic and witchcraft? Or rather, fear and superstition? I'm Rebecca Strazina, and this is The West London Witch, episode 113, The Witches of York.
In the spring of 1538, a woman walked to the gallows in York accused of trying to murder Henry VIII. She had no weapon, no poison, no army. According to the Crown, she had tried to kill the king through fasting. Her name was Mabel Brigg.
There is very little information regarding Mabel Brigg, and that's due to the fact that she was not a woman of nobility or high regard, but rather a lowly servant working for a family in East Riding, Yorkshire. The only reason we know anything about Mabel today is because the Tudor courts and government believed that she was dangerous and powerful enough to execute the king.
Mabel was probably born around 1506, somewhere in Yorkshire. She lived in a world that was harsh, even by Tudor standards. A world of hunger, religion, gossip, fear, survival. By the time history catches sight of her, she was already widowed, poor, and raising 2 children who were working in a servant household in the East Riding of Yorkshire. Now, women like her rarely entered official records. Poor women disappeared through history silently unless married to wealth, committed crimes, or died incredibly violently. Mabel hits the trifecta. All three in the eyes of the state. She became poor, suspicious, and finally condemned.
In order to understand Mabel's tragic demise, we have to understand England in the 1530s.
Now, Henry VIII shattered the country. He had broken from the Catholic Church, declared himself supreme leader of the head of the Church of England, and begun tearing down monasteries across the kingdom. Only 2 years earlier, the region had erupted in open religion during Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising against Henry religion's reforms. And that rebellion failed, executions followed, and the government became obsessed with enemies, prophecies, vision, curses, anything that basically went against Henry VIII.
At the time, there was no separation of church and state. Politics and religion were inseparable. Fear and suspicion spread quickly throughout the nation. And it was in that atmosphere and context that Mabel Brigg became known for a ritual called the Black Fast.
Now, the Black Fast is an extremely religious fast. It involves not eating meat, dairy, and very little food, and a lot of prayer.
A black fast was a ritual traditionally practiced during Lent in early Christianity. But people would also undergo the religious black fast in order to seek God's help, pay penance, pray for healing, justice, or recovery of lost profits, property, or goods. And if you yourself could not perform the fast for whatever reason, you could pay someone else to fast for you. And that's where Mabel comes in. She was very gifted at performing black fasts.
Mabel was an incredibly religious woman, but it was also associated with witchcraft. You see, fasting was thought a way for witches to cause harm to others. Now, at some point in 1537, a woman named Isabel Buck approached Mabel. Isabel reportedly suffered from a miscarriage and was physically weakened. According to the surviving testimonies, she wanted to help recovering lost money and believed the black fast might actually help. The payment towards Mabel for completing the black fast was small. It was a peck of wheat and half a yard of linen. That detail lingers because it strips away any fantasy of a secret power, secret occult power. These were not wealthy conspirators plotting in the shadows. They were poor women exchanging food and cloth in a world that was superstitious.
On the surface, this arrangement was not a big deal. Isabel paid Mabel to undergo a 3-day fast on her behalf. And a local chantry priest even approved the arrangement. It was not illegal or magical, just a religious practice. So, how did King Henry VIII get involved?
Then the accusations changed. The family Mabel worked for, John and Agnes Lockhart, and I mention the names because I think it's important for people to know who actually accused her, said that this fast was being done to kill the king. King Henry VIII. This is a serious accusation. And they also said that she had used it before to kill another man who actually died, and not in a nice way. He broke his neck. Now suddenly the matter becomes treason, conspiring to kill a king.
But why did the Lockharts accuse Mabel of such a treasonous crime? Well, we don't know. The archives don't really shed light on the motives. Perhaps they really believed Mabel was up to no good. Or perhaps there was a conflict in the household, a dispute or a quarrel between Mabel and the Lockars. But we truly do not know why the situation escalated to the courts.
The authorities began interrogations in York. Witnesses contradicted each other constantly, and the stories shifted. Mabel denied any treasonous intent. At one point, she even claimed that John Locker himself had offered her money to fast against the king before turning against her. The priest later rebuked all parties for slander and accusations. The entire case is unstable. Reading the records, it becomes difficult to separate truth from fear. Maybe Mabel genuinely performing a spiritual ritual believed she had power? The thing is, the records never answer questions clearly. It is incredibly uncertain, and throughout this, we only have what authorities give us. We never have Mabel's voice herself, because whatever is recorded is always recorded by the victor, which is not Mabel.
Regardless of the whys, all that mattered to the Tudor courts was that Mabel's black fasts were connected to the king, therefore constituting treason.
Mabel Brigg was convicted of treason and hanged at York on 7th of April in 1538. She was about 32 years old.
Isabel Buck, the original commissioner of the Black Fast, was also arrested, tried, and convicted alongside Mabel Brigg. However, she was spared the noose. After Mabel's death, this entire tale almost faded away completely. There's no gravestone for Mabel, no personal writings or champions on her side keeping her memory alive. But her story lives on because it holds a mirror up to the way that women, particularly poor women, were treated.
5 centuries later, her story still survives because it captures something unsettling about that moment in English history. A poor woman fasted and prayed in rural Yorkshire. Treason.
Now, Mabel may have been an ordinary woman just trying to survive in extraordinarily difficult times. But not all who were accused of witchcraft were innocent, like poor Mabel Brigg. There always has to be one person who lets the side down. And that brings us to our next supposed witch. The merciless, unscrupulous, and ruthless Mary Bateman.
Imagine industrial Leeds, 1806. The city is starting to become congested. It's not a very clean place. Disease and illness around. And a young woman called Rebecca Perigo believes she has a spiritual ailment. She's tried everything. Her husband is desperate to find a cure for it. And her niece tells her about a wise woman that she knows and a place called Black Dog Yard in Leeds. The woman's name is Mary Bateman, and Rebecca calls upon her services. That is the beginning of the end for Rebecca. Mary Bateman, she was known as the Yorkshire Witch. She wasn't a witch. She was a fraud, a thief, a con artist, a poisoner, and ultimately a murderer.
Mary Bateman was born in 1768 in Asenbury, Yorkshire. Her family were farmers, and she became a domestic servant.
In 1780, when she was around 12 or 13, she had a job in Thirsk as a domestic servant. She didn't last very long because she began thieving. She became addicted to it, I think. Wherever she went, she took things. Now, obviously, she didn't last very long as a servant in Thirsk, and she had many different jobs.
At about 20 years old, Mary moved to York for work. But once again, that job falls apart quickly. So the next year, she heads to Leeds. And this becomes a bit of a pattern for Mary. She would be involved in some petty crime and flee to a new location in order to avoid any repercussions or punishments.
So she ended up in Leeds making clothes, but there wasn't much money to be made there. So she supplemented her income by becoming a fortune teller. Then in February 1793, she married wheelwright John Bateman in Leeds. She carried on stealing. And the records tell us that she stole from people in the lodgings where she and her husband lived.
Mary was so morally repugnant that once after a large devastational fire, she hit the streets, begging people for donations of clothing and fabric to give to the destitute fire survivors. But in actuality, she sold and pawned off the donated goods to get money for herself.
Initially, it's thought her husband had no idea of this secret life until one day he came back home and all their furniture had gone. She'd sold it to pay off one of her victims. Now, at some point, John joined the army. I think it was probably to get his wife away from Leeds and the life she was living and the crimes she was committing. But they returned in 1799, and Mary's reputation as a wise woman began to grow.
Mary built a reputation as a fortune teller, a healer, a magical practitioner who sold charms and potions, protective talismans, and could even remove wicked curses or bewitchments. And there were rumors that she also performed abortions.
I don't believe she had any special powers, but she knew how gullible and desperate people were, and she exploited that. She was very good at that. Now, this is the curious story. She had a hen, which she called the Prophet Hen of Leeds. And this hen laid eggs. Supposedly, on them was written, "Christ is coming." She charged people to see this hen, to see it lay these eggs and to see the writing on the eggs when they came out. And people were astounded. Actually, it transpired. She actually wrote on the eggs herself using acid, vinegar probably, to etch it into the shell. And then what did she do? She reinserted the eggs back up the hen's bottom to lay later.
This was a truly horrifying and disgusting practice. We have many chickens on the Strezina family farm, and I love them all so dearly. This story made me physically ill and angry.
Now, I can see by your reaction, that's exactly the reaction we get on the tour. And it always amuses me. And I always say this on the tour. Because on the tour, we talk about people having their heads chopped off, being hanged, being drawn and quartered, being burnt. But it's always the chicken that gets the reaction. So, this is where the story becomes intriguing. Because she started to use other women, supposedly, as an intermediary. She was saying she wasn't able to cure all these things herself. She wasn't able to cure all these bewitchments. But she used a couple of intermediaries. One was a Mrs. Moore, and the other one was a Miss Blythe, who lived in Scarborough. She will feature much more.
The grift was admittedly very clever. A poor, desperate person would go to Mary with their specific ailment for help. Mary would see them and then say, "Gosh, I wish I could help, but this is beyond my remit." Or, "You need a specialist." So she would have the unknowing victim write a letter to her witch colleagues, Miss Blythe or Miss Moore, to ask for their expertise. She told them to pay the postage and give her the letters so that she could mail them off. And then she would send the victims home to wait for a reply.
Of course, she didn't post the letters. She kept the postage for herself, along with her own fees, and then pretended that she got a reply from Miss Blythe or Mrs. Moore.
This is the equivalent of you going to your general practitioner with a complaint about your eye. Your doctor says, "Sorry, but I can't help you. You need an ophthalmologist. Give me $20 and I will connect you with one." You pay up. And the GP pockets not only your copay for the appointment, but also the $20. They never connect you with a real specialist, but rather send you a vague email about eye health from one of their burner email accounts. Literally the definition of a scam.
So in 1806, she set on a path that would eventually cost her life, take her to the gallows. She met Rebecca Perigot, as we said earlier. Rebecca was convinced that she had an ailment, a spiritual ailment, and William, her husband, was absolutely desperate to save his wife and find a cure for her. So Rebecca's niece introduced her to Mary Bateman. She said she was a wise woman and would be able to help. In the 10 months that she was helping them, she managed to extract from the Perigots £70, which was an enormous sum in those days, plus many different household items. She used Miss Blythe as an intermediary. Miss Blythe wrote to William and said he should sew charms into Rebecca's mattress, which would ward off the spirits and cure her. He was supposed to give golden guineas to Mary Bateman, who would create charms and then sew them into Rebecca's mattress. Also told them, and this is very important, of course, that any correspondence from Miss Blythe, once they had read it, should be destroyed.
In 1807, Mary Bateman tells the Perigots that she's had a letter from Miss Blythe with some very serious and troubling news. According to Miss Blythe, Rebecca was soon to fall gravely ill and suffer from a sickness sent by God. The only way Rebecca could survive and prevent death was to follow Miss Blythe's instructions.
Mary Bateman gave them a series of packets with a white powder in and told them they must mix it into puddings, which would then ward off this illness that was coming. The 5 packets they received, everything was fine. The 6th packet they received was a bit larger than the others. They mixed it into puddings. William took 1 spoonful of the pudding and declared it was terrible. It was a terrible taste. But Rebecca, his wife, was convinced that this was going to cure her. After about 3 or 4 spoonfuls, she began to have a violent reaction. She became violently ill. But again, following Miss Blythe's instructions earlier, she had told them never to consult a doctor. They were to follow her instructions completely. So, a week later, Sunday, 24th of May, 1807, Rebecca died. Her tongue was swollen, her features were discoloured and distorted. And unbelievably, William still consulted Mary. They'd even given 1 spoonful of the pudding, or some of the pudding, to one of the cats. What happened? The cat died. So, he still consults Mary. He sends more things to Miss Blythe. She asks for one of Mary's dresses. He became so desperate for money, though, at this point, he decided he would take the charms out of his wife's mattress and use it for money, because he had no money. So he took the charms out. Once he took the charms out of the mattress and opened them up, what was in? Not gold sovereigns, not gold guineas, pennies, farthings, and scraps of paper.
William now knew that he had been conned. And on the 20th of October, 1808, he alerted the authorities, who subsequently went to Mary Bateman's abode and conducted a search of the premises.
They found various substances and poisons in her premises from her previous victims. So she was charged with murder at York Castle. Even then, she was carrying out some of her cons. She got one of the inmates there to sew charms into her mattress. Of course, there were charms, she'd given her guineas, usual story. So she went to the assize trials in March 1809, because the assize trials were only held so many times a year. So it was March 1809 before she went to the assize trials. The trial lasted 11 hours. She was found guilty by the jury within minutes. Again, she hadn't finished. She told the judge that she was 22 weeks pregnant to try and avoid a hanging. So the judge was skeptical. He ordered a panel of matrons, married women, to inspect Mary and find out whether she was indeed pregnant. She wasn't, of course. Another con.
On March 20th, 1809, Mary Bateman was hanged at York Castle before a massive crowd. Thousands of people came to witness the death of this now notorious con artist.
And her body was then taken from York Castle, and it was taken to Leeds Infirmary. And people actually lined the route to watch the coffin go past. It went to Leeds Infirmary because in those days, criminals that were executed, their bodies were often used for medical science. So she went to Leeds Infirmary. The surgeon, man by the name of William Hay, took 3 days to dissect the body because he was charging people to go and watch. So on the first day, he charged medical students who paid to watch, about 100 medical students. On the second day, professional men were allowed to go watch, paid 5 guineas a time. And on the third day, women were allowed to go and watch the final dissection and learn about the death. Then, this is the macabre part, strips of her skin were tanned, turned into leather as charms to ward off evil spirits. And supposedly, allegedly, there were 2 books which were covered in her skin, but actually went missing.
The irony that strips of Mary Bateman's flesh were sold off as charms to ward off evil spirits is, in a word, wild. Mary Bateman herself was an evil spirit. But the story of Mary's remains only gets more bizarre.
And incredibly, Mary Bateman's body was on public display until 2015. There's a museum in Leeds at St James Hospital, the Thackeray Medical Museum, which people can go and see. And there was a mock-up of a Victorian street. And in the street, in 2015, was a glass case in which hung a skeleton of Mary Bateman, a.k.a. the Yorkshire Witch.
Now, interestingly enough, Mary wasn't convicted of witchcraft, but rather of murder. Due to the change in the Witchcraft Act, there was no longer such things as witches. But that did not mean that her status as the Wicked Witch of Yorkshire was not published and sensationalized.
When she was charged, she was obviously charged with murder, but there was a broadsheet at the time which stated that she now forfeits her life for witchcraft and murder. But the witchcraft law was repealed in 1736. That made witchcraft a crime punishable by death. That was repealed in 1736. So she couldn't have been charged with witchcraft. So it was probably just the broadsheet over-egging the pudding, if we can use that expression, to sell more copies. But there was actually a law which made it a criminal act to be pretending to be a witch. So the witchcraft law had been repealed and the death sentence for witchcraft had been repealed, but it was still a law which said if it was a criminal act if you pretended to be a witch.
Stories like Mabel Briggs and Mary Bateman's remain relevant and so poignant because they remind us of how powerful and insidious fear, superstition, rumor, and societal pressure can be. Mabel's case highlights how ordinary religious or folk practices can become entangled and ensnared with superstition and politics, leading to accusations that can destroy lives. And on the opposite side of the coin, Mary Bateman encapsulates how charismatic individuals can exploit fear and vulnerability for personal gain. And if you think those dangers are in the distant past, think again. Today, in 2026, misinformation, conspiracy theories, scams, and public outrage abound. These stories force us to remember the importance of critical thinking, balanced and unbiased evidence, and remind us of the human consequences that can occur when fear is allowed to outweigh reason. A huge thank you to Nyx and David for bringing these stories to us. These are just 2 of the tales shared on the Witches Tour, and I cannot recommend the tour enough. It's a magical way to take in the city, see something different, learn something new, all while getting some steps in and having a few laughs. A perfect way to spend an afternoon in York. Do you have a spooky story you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Drop me an email at thewestlondonwitch@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at The West London Witch. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. And come and follow us for additional content on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. The West London Witch is created by me, Rebecca Strazina. Our sound designer and production magician is the incredible Danny Cross. Our theme music was bespokely written and performed by the wickedly talented Kyle Hall. Our cover art is the beautiful collaboration between Lizzie Wilson and Jake Bowser. Special thanks to Miss Sinead Bowers, our quality control and biggest cheerleader. And thank you to you, all of our listeners all over the world. These are your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.